Have you ever wondered what secrets the darkness is hiding? Tonight we venture into the shadows where old, forgotten places still pulse with eerie life. We're about to unravel the chilling mysteries of Black Hollow Lake, Ward 13, in a realm where creatures of shadow lurk, waiting for their next victim. But before we dive in, take a deep breath and imagine this: a quiet lake, its surface still, hiding decades-old secrets beneath its murky depths. An abandoned hospital, its crumbling walls echoing with whispers that refuse to be silenced. And then, shadows. Not just shadows, but creatures from a realm beyond our understanding. Lurking, waiting, watching. These are the stories of places that refuse to die, and tonight we'll uncover what's still alive in their darkness. These aren't just old ghost stories. These places are still very much awake, and they want you to listen. It's strange, isn't it? How a place can feel so still, so quiet, like the world just forgot it existed. That's what Black Hollow Lake is, tucked deep into the woods, miles from any town, where cell phones don't get bars and the water always seems too dark, even under the sun. When a group of friends rented a cabin there for a long weekend, they thought it would be perfect. No distractions, no noise, just nature. But by the second night, they realized they weren't alone. At first, it was just whispers, faint, garbled, like the breeze was carrying someone's voice across the water. They joked about it, of course. They laughed, turned up their music, and brushed it off as their imaginations playing tricks. But the whispers didn't stop. They got louder, closer, like they were coming from the lake itself. And then the dreams started. Dreams of a girl, her face just a shadow, her hand reaching up from the water. The kind of dreams you wake from sweating, your heart pounding, but with no memory of how they end. By the third night, one of them woke up outside, barefoot, shivering, standing ankle deep in the freezing water. She didn't remember getting there. She didn't even remember going to bed. But she wasn't the only one. Soon they all started waking up in strange places, their clothes damp, their hands muddy. And every night, the whispers became words. Words calling them by name. Words they couldn't ignore. It wasn't long before they realized they weren't dreaming at all. Something was pulling them to the lake. Black Hollow Lake isn't just some forgotten spot on the map. It has a history that's buried beneath the surface, waiting for someone to notice. And the friends? They were about to uncover why no one who hears those whispers ever comes back the same, or sometimes doesn't come back at all. This is their story. Black Hollow Lake is the kind of place you'd see on a postcard and never actually visit. The water is perfectly still most of the time, almost too still, reflecting the dense canopy of trees that seem to stretch endlessly around it. There's no road leading directly there, just a narrow gravel trail, barely wide enough for a car, weaving through the woods until the lake finally reveals itself. For the group of friends, it seemed like the perfect escape. They needed a break from their lives, a weekend to disconnect, a cabin by a peaceful lake with nothing but nature for miles. It felt like a dream, but sometimes dreams turn into something else entirely. The cabin itself was old. You could tell just by the way the wood looked, gray and splintered from years of weathering. Inside, it smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic, like the scent of the lake had seeped into the very walls. The furniture was sparse, mismatched, and the lights flickered faintly when they flipped the switches. But it didn't matter. They weren't there for luxury. They were there for the quiet. By the first night, they noticed it, the sound. It was faint, almost easy to ignore, a murmur just above the sound of the water outside. None of them could make out what it was, but they all heard it. "It's probably just the wind," someone said, laughing it off. But the wind wasn't blowing that night. And the sound wasn't coming from the trees or the cabin, it was coming from the lake. The second night, things got stranger. The whispers were louder now, but still indistinct, like a conversation just out of earshot. One of them went to the edge of the dock, curious. "Hello?" she called out, her voice carrying into the darkness. No one answered, but when she turned to walk back, she saw something, or thought she did, just beneath the surface of the water. A shadow, motionless, too big to be a fish, but too vague to be anything else. She didn't tell the others. She convinced herself it was just her mind playing tricks. But that night, she dreamed of a girl standing at the end of the dock, dripping wet, her face turned away. When she woke up, her feet were covered in mud, and her shoes were nowhere to be found. By the third night, they knew something was wrong. The whispers were words now, names. Each of their names, carried on the breeze that came from nowhere. They tried to stay awake, tried to keep the lights on, but it didn't matter. One by one, they woke up outside, standing at the edge of the lake, their toes inches from the water, staring into the blackness. None of them could remember how they got there, and none of them could stop themselves from going back to sleep, only to wake up closer and closer to the water each time. They started piecing it together, the history of Black Hollow Lake. The locals didn't talk about it much, not because they didn't know, but because they didn't want to remember. Decades ago, a girl had drowned there. The official story was an accident, but the rumors were darker. They said she was pushed, that she fought, that her screams could still be heard on quiet nights, echoing across the water. No one ever found her body, and no one ever fished or swam in Black Hollow Lake after that. Some places just have a way of holding on to their secrets. The friends didn't believe in ghost stories, not at first, but belief doesn't matter when you're being pulled towards something. By the fourth night, it was clear. The whispers weren't asking for their attention. They were commanding it. And the lake wasn't just a body of water, it was a doorway to something that wasn't ready to let go. Mia, the group planner and eternal optimist. Ben, her boyfriend, always skeptical but along for the ride. Sarah, their quiet, introspective friend. And Kyle, the joker, the one who always made light of things, even when he shouldn't. They were looking for a break, a reset from the grind of city life. What they got was something they couldn't have imagined. The cabin, a squat, weather-beaten structure nestled at the edge of the lake, had its own personality. The wood, faded to a dull gray, seemed to groan under its own weight. The windows, coated with a thin film of grime, let in just enough light to cast long, jagged shadows across the walls. Inside, the air was damp, with a faint hint of mildew that clung to everything. But it was cozy in its own way, with a fireplace that still worked and a small stack of wood out back. They laughed about the quirks at first. The way the doors never quite closed right, the odd carvings in the beams that looked like they were done with a pocket knife, and the fact that the previous owner had left behind a single chair by the dock, a chair pointed directly at the water. The first few hours were uneventful. They unpacked, lit a fire, and played cards while the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and red. But when the night fell, so did the silence. That was when they heard it for the first time, the faint, rhythmic sound drifting across the water. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the call of some nocturnal animal. It was something else. A voice, maybe? A chant? It was hard to tell, but it was there, undeniable, cutting through the stillness like a thread unraveling a fragile fabric. They joked about it at first, trying to shake the unease that crept into the room. "Probably the wind," Kyle said, but even he didn't sound convinced. It was Sarah who noticed the footprints first. Bare footprints, too small to belong to any of them, leading from the edge of the dock to the cabin's door. They were faint, like they'd been made hours earlier, but the lake was calm, and no one else was around for miles. They brushed it off as a prank, maybe some local kids messing with them. But when Sarah woke up that night, standing knee-deep in the freezing water, with no memory of how she got there, the laughter stopped. Mia was the next. They found her outside at dawn, her face pale, her hands trembling as she stared at the water. She wouldn't or couldn't say what she saw, but she wouldn't go near the lake again. Ben tried to keep everyone grounded, insisting there had to be a rational explanation. But when Kyle started speaking in his sleep, whispering the same name over and over, Lila, the cracks in their resolve began to show. None of them knew anyone by that name, but the whispers outside seemed to echo it back, like a question, like a demand. By the fourth night, the pieces started falling into place, or maybe they were being placed for them. An old newspaper clipping left behind in a drawer. A photo of a girl, no older than 16, her expression caught between fear and defiance. The story was vague, incomplete, but the words Black Hollow Lake were scrawled in the margins, along with a date, July 1974. They found more, records of a search party, witness statements that contradicted each other, and finally an article from years later describing a group of campers who went missing. Their belongings were found, their tents still standing, but not a single trace of the campers themselves. The whispers were louder now, almost deafening. They didn't just hear them, they felt them, crawling under their skin, pulling at their thoughts, turning them against each other. And the lake, it wasn't just calling them, it was waiting for them. They knew they couldn't leave, not without understanding, not without finishing what had started decades ago. But the truth, when they finally uncovered it, wasn't just a story of a girl who drowned. It was something far older, something buried beneath the water, something that had been waiting for someone to listen. What would you do if the very air around you felt alive, as though it was holding its breath, waiting for you to make the wrong move? What if every sound, every shadow, was trying to tell you something, and you just couldn't figure out what it was? For Mia, Ben, Sarah, and Kyle, the cabin at Black Hollow Lake wasn't just a getaway anymore. It had become a trap, one that tightened its grip with each passing night. But why? What did it want from them? And why them, specifically? By the fifth day, they were no longer just visitors at the lake. They were players in a story they didn't understand. Kyle, once the group's comic relief, now barely spoke. He sat by the window most of the day, staring at the water with an expression none of them could decipher. Sarah, already quiet by nature, had grown more withdrawn, her hands trembling whenever the whisper started. And Mia, she had taken it upon herself to find answers. She pored over every scrap of paper, every drawer and crevice of the cabin, desperate to find something, anything, that could explain what was happening. That's when she found it. Behind an old, warped cabinet, hidden beneath layers of cobwebs, was a small locked box. The key was nowhere to be found, but that didn't stop her. With a knife and sheer determination, she pried it open, revealing its contents. A journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The handwriting was shaky, erratic, but the words were clear. The journal belonged to Lila, the same name Kyle had been whispering in his sleep. And as Mia read, the pieces began to fall into place. Lila was a local girl, the daughter of a fisherman who lived on the other side of the lake. According to the journal, she had spent most of her childhood at the water's edge, skipping stones and listening to her father's stories about the lake's spirit. A guardian, he said, that protected the lake and punished those who disrespected it. But as Lila grew older, the stories took on a darker tone. She began to write about voices she heard at night, calling her name, in dreams of drowning that left her gasping for air when she woke. Her father dismissed her fears as the product of an overactive imagination, but the journal told a different story. The last entry was short, scrawled hastily in the margins. "The water wants me. I don't think I can fight it anymore." Mia shared the journal with the others, but instead of clarity, it brought more questions. Why had no one mentioned Lila before? What happened to her? And why was her presence still so strong, decades later? As they debated their next move, the whispers returned, louder this time, almost angry. And then came the laughter, soft at first but growing, echoing through the cabin like it was coming from the walls themselves. That's when Ben saw the figure. Standing at the edge of the dock, silhouetted against the faint light of the moon, was a girl. Her hair clung to her face, wet and tangled, and her dress, though soaked, seemed to float around her like it had a life of its own. Ben shouted to the others, but when they rushed outside, the figure was gone. Only the chair remained, now tipped over, as though someone had just stood from it. That night, none of them slept. The next morning, they decided to leave, but the lake had other plans. The car wouldn't start. Their phones, which had been working just fine, now refused to connect to anything. And the path that had brought them to the cabin? It seemed different, almost unrecognizable, as though the forest itself had shifted to keep them there. That's when they realized they weren't just guests at Black Hollow Lake, they were prisoners. But here's the question, why them? What had they done to deserve this? And more importantly, what would you do if you were in their place? Would you try to escape, knowing the odds were against you? Or would you stay and try to uncover the truth, no matter the cost? For Mia, Ben, Sarah, and Kyle, the choice was clear. If they were going to survive, they had to understand the lake's secrets. But as they delved deeper into its history, they discovered something far worse than they ever could have imagined. To this day, Black Hollow Lake holds its secrets close. No bodies were ever found, no official reports filed, and no explanations given. All that remains is the cabin, a weathered, lonely structure that sits untouched on the shore, as if daring someone else to try their luck. What really happened to Mia, Ben, Sarah, and Kyle? Did they escape the lake's grasp, or did they become part of the legend themselves? And the whispers, are they truly the voice of Lila, crying out for justice, or something far older, far darker, using her story as a mask? We may never know. Black Hollow Lake has become a place of speculation, a mystery that locals avoid and thrill seekers obsess over. Some say they've heard the whispers themselves, late at night, if the wind is just right. Others claim the lake is cursed, that it takes what it wants and gives nothing back. But here's the thing. For every story, there's someone who believes. And for every believer, there's someone willing to risk everything to find the truth. What would you do? If you were there, standing on that dock with the whispers calling your name, would you stay and face the unknown? Or would you run, knowing the lake never lets anyone leave without taking something in return? The story of Black Hollow Lake isn't just about what happened to Mia, Ben, Sarah, and Kyle. It's about what the lake might still be hiding. And maybe, just maybe, it's waiting for someone like you to uncover its final secret. Was it Lila seeking revenge, or something far older, using her tragedy to lure its victims? What would you have done if you were in their shoes? Drop your theories in the comments below. I'd love to hear them. And don't forget, the lake may look calm, but its depths are anything but calm. What would you do if you walked into a place everyone warned you about? A place that had been abandoned for decades and felt like something, someone, was still watching you? It sounds insane, right? But this wasn't just any place. This was a psychiatric hospital, once a sanctuary for the mentally ill, or so they say. Today the walls are crumbling, the windows shattered, but the real story, that story's still alive, hidden in the dark corners of this forsaken building, and it's waiting to be uncovered. In today's story, we follow an ambitious journalist named Emily Walker, who thought she was just chasing a story, just another creepy investigation into the unknown. But what she uncovers is far more than she bargained for. As she digs deeper, she stumbles across whispers of a secret ward, a ward that wasn't even supposed to exist. And the more she learns, the more she realizes that the spirits of the hospital's past aren't as peaceful as everyone believed. These aren't just restless souls, they're angry, and they want something from her. Emily Walker stood at the edge of the hospital grounds, her heart pounding in her chest. The air was thick, heavy with a silence that seemed to stretch endlessly, broken only by the soft crunch of dead leaves beneath her boots. The once grand building loomed before her, its windows dark, staring back like hollow eyes of some long-dead creature. The doors, once heavy and imposing, now hung ajar, creaking with every gust of wind. The building was not just abandoned, it felt like it had been waiting for someone to step inside. The first step into the hospital was like crossing into another world. The musty air hit her immediately, damp, with a faint trace of something metallic, like the scent of the lake had seeped into the very walls. The floors, once gleaming with sterile white tiles, were now covered in dirt and debris, the remnants of forgotten lives. The hallways seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, flickering lights above her casting eerie shadows that danced as if they had a life of their own. Emily's breath echoed in the empty space, but it was the silence that really unsettled her. It wasn't the kind of quiet you'd expect in an abandoned building. This silence was thick, like it was trying to hold on to something that had been here long after the hospital had closed its doors. It felt suffocating, as though the air was trying to keep the secrets of the past locked inside, where they couldn't escape. The sound of her own footsteps was all she could hear as she moved deeper into the building. But then, just as she rounded the corner, something caught her eye. A faded, yellowed sign on the wall. The words were barely legible, worn by time, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. Ward 13, private patients only. Emily paused, her mind racing. She had read about this ward, but she had never expected to find it. Ward 13 wasn't listed on any official records. No one was ever supposed to know about it. But here it was, staring back at her, a door to the past that was never meant to be open. The deeper she ventured into the building, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Every room she passed seemed to be covered in a thick layer of dust, but there was something else too. Something that made the air feel colder, heavier. Like something was breathing just behind her, watching, waiting. As she reached the end of the hall, she saw it, an old wooden door, half open, with a rusted lock that seemed to have been broken years ago. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine. This was it. Ward 13. She stepped closer, the door creaking loudly as she pushed it open. Inside was the faint glow of what remained of the building's flickering lights. The room was nothing like she had imagined. There were no patient beds or chairs, just old files scattered across a desk. Some of them burned beyond recognition, others yellowed with age. The walls were adorned with faded, cracked photos, faces of people she didn't recognize, their expressions frozen in time, their eyes dull and lifeless. But then something caught her eye, a mirror placed carefully on the wall opposite her. The glass was clouded with grime, but when Emily's reflection appeared in the mirror, she noticed something strange. She wasn't alone. For just a second, she thought she saw a figure standing behind her, tall with a pale, featureless face. The moment she turned around, the figure was gone. Her breath caught in her throat. She wasn't alone. As she turned back to the mirror, a chill swept through the room. The lights flickered once more, then went out completely, leaving her in the pitch black. Her heart hammered in her chest as she fumbled for her flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. She swung it around the room, her pulse racing, but there was nothing. Nothing but the smell of decay, the soft hum of the air, and the faintest whisper. So soft, she wasn't sure if she'd heard it at all. Emily's stomach turned. This was more than just an abandoned building. This was a place that held something, someone, trapped in time. And as the lights flickered back on, revealing the walls around her once more, she couldn't shake the feeling that the ghosts of the hospital's past weren't just lingering in the shadows. They were watching her, waiting for her to uncover their story. Or perhaps something more. Emily's flashlight flickered weakly, casting long shadows across the walls, as the sound of her own breathing seemed unnervingly loud in the otherwise silent space. As she inched forward into the heart of Ward 13, her mind raced. There had to be more here. This couldn't just be an abandoned wing of the hospital. There was something deeper, something far darker waiting to be uncovered. She spotted a large filing cabinet against the wall, its drawers half pulled out, as though someone had been rummaging through it in a hurry. Her curiosity piqued. She moved toward it, her flashlight sweeping over old medical records, faded and yellowed with age. The further she looked, the more it became clear. These weren't ordinary records. The patients listed here were marked with symbols, strange notations in the margins, almost like warnings. One name stood out, Dr. Edward Voss, the head doctor of this very hospital, who had mysteriously disappeared decades ago. The file labeled his work as experimental, noting that he had been researching a groundbreaking but dangerous method of psychiatric treatment. Theories about his practices had circulated for years, but what was most disturbing was the note about Subject 13. No other information followed, but it was enough to send a chill down Emily's spine. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Every part of her wanted to leave, to run from this building, but her journalistic instincts pushed her forward. She flipped through the files with trembling hands until she found a document that made her heart stop. It was a report detailing the final stages of Dr. Voss's experiments, a process he described as reaching the mind's darkest recesses. But what the report didn't say, what it alluded to only in cryptic terms, was that the doctor's treatment had crossed a line. The last few patients weren't treated, they were used, and their bodies disappeared. Subject 13, she whispered aloud, trying to make sense of it. But as she read further, she realized that the document stopped abruptly, as though someone had ripped the rest out of the file. The mystery deepened. Dr. Voss had vanished shortly after this, leaving behind only rumors of his research and his twisted theories on the human mind. And now it seemed that the restless spirits of his patients were trying to tell their story, their final cries still echoing through the building. She turned to leave the room, the weight of the documents in her hands, but as she moved toward the door, something caught her eye. Movement. At first, she thought it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, but the silhouette that appeared in the doorway wasn't just in her head. A figure standing motionless was staring at her from the shadows. It was a woman, pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow as though she hadn't seen the light of day in decades. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Was this one of the patients? "Who are you?" Emily whispered, barely able to speak. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she began to move, stepping slowly towards Emily, her feet dragging across the floor, leaving behind an echoing scrape that sent shivers down Emily's spine. The figure reached out a hand, an impossibly cold, skeletal hand, and just as it touched Emily's arm, a searing pain shot through her body, as if the touch had burned her from the inside out. Emily staggered back, her heart racing. She could barely breathe. But when she looked down at her arm, there was nothing. No mark, no burn, just a lingering sensation of coldness, as if it hadn't happened at all. But she knew it had. She took a step back, adrenaline coursing through her veins, and the apparition vanished into thin air, as if it had never been there at all. She was left standing alone, her mind racing, trying to piece together the fragments of what she had just witnessed. But as Emily tried to collect her thoughts, she heard something else. A door somewhere deep within the hospital creaked open. It was faint but unmistakable. Someone or something was moving inside. And as Emily's flashlight flickered once more, a low, guttural voice whispered from the darkness, "You're not alone here." The air grew colder. The walls seemed to close in on her. And Emily knew this wasn't just a haunted hospital. It was a place of twisted experiments where the dead hadn't just lingered. They had been kept alive in some form, driven to madness by the very treatments they had endured. But what was the real truth? And what would she find in the depths of the hospital that could explain what happened to them? What she didn't know was that the answers to those questions lay deep within the bowels of the building, where no one had dared to go for years. But Emily wasn't alone in her search. And as she ventured further into the hospital's heart, she would soon realize that the spirits weren't just restless, they were vengeful. Emily had uncovered a dark history hidden within the walls of the abandoned hospital. A history of twisted experiments, vengeful spirits, and a doctor whose name would never be forgotten. But what she couldn't uncover was the truth behind the figure that haunted her. The one who claimed she wasn't supposed to be there. Was it Dr. Voss, forever tied to the darkness of his own creation? Or was something more sinister still at play? As the echoes of Isabel's name lingered in the air, unanswered questions swirled around Emily's mind, and the mystery of Ward 13 remains unresolved, locked away in the haunted corners of the hospital. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to the souls trapped within those walls, or why Emily's search had stirred something that had been lying dormant for decades. The hospital stands empty, but it's clear. Some places are never truly abandoned. What do you think? Was it the spirit of Dr. Voss trapped in the confines of his own twisted experiments? Or did Isabel and the others find a way to reclaim what was taken from them? Could the past still have power over the present? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Tonight, we're not lingering in the halls of an abandoned hospital. We're shifting focus, stepping into the quiet streets of a suburban neighborhood where the silence is thick and the air is charged with something dark. A place where children have started to disappear, one by one, without a trace. It's not a hospital that keeps its secrets here. No, in this town, the real danger lies in the shadows themselves, waiting for the right moment to strike. Now let's uncover the terrifying truth behind the disappearances in this seemingly peaceful town. A truth that no one could have imagined. This is the story of a teenager who stumbles upon a dark secret, one that the adults have overlooked for years. The children? They're not just gone. They've been taken by shadow-like creatures, known as the Shadowborn, who thrive in the darkness and are only visible in the faintest light. When these creatures take her younger brother, she must venture into their shadow realm to rescue him. But as she delves deeper, she realizes escaping their world is not only harder than she ever imagined, it's beginning to feel like the creatures themselves are coming for her too. It was a quiet evening, like any other in the small suburban town, but something felt off. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying a strange chill that couldn't be explained. The streets were empty, the houses stood silent, and yet the tension in the air was palpable. It was as if the town itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. The only sound was the soft hum of a distant streetlight flickering, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch too far. In the corner of the town, hidden away from the bustling streets, lived a teenage girl named Avery. She had always felt the quiet beauty of this place, but lately something had shifted. She had seen the signs, the things that didn't add up, the disappearances of children. First, it was little Timmy from down the block, then Chloe, the girl who always waved as she passed by on her bike. But no one was talking about it. People tried to ignore it, to act like everything was fine. But Avery knew. She could feel it. Something was happening, something she couldn't explain, and it terrified her more than anything she had ever known. One night, Avery's worst fear became a reality. She was sitting in her room, staring out the window at the street below, when a strange darkness began to fall over the neighborhood. The lights flickered, casting shadows that danced unnaturally against the houses, stretching longer than they should. The air grew colder, biting at her skin through the thin fabric of her hoodie. She turned her gaze back to the street, her heart suddenly racing. She could have sworn she saw a figure lurking near the trees, barely visible in the dimming light, moving too quickly to be human. Avery's younger brother, Jack, had been playing outside just moments before. She had told him to come in, but he hadn't listened. Now she couldn't see him anywhere. Panic surged in her chest as she ran to the door, but when she stepped outside, the air felt thick, heavy with an unnatural stillness. There were no sounds of crickets, no rustling leaves, just the oppressive silence that seemed to smother everything. "Avery!" Jack's voice called out from somewhere in the darkness. It was faint, almost like it was coming from another world, but she could hear the panic in his tone. She rushed toward the sound, but the more she ran, the further away it seemed. She called his name back, but there was no answer. Just the whisper of wind against the trees and the crackling of dried leaves beneath her feet. Then she saw it, a shadow, taller than any person should be, moving just at the edge of the light. It seemed to be watching her, lurking in the corner of her vision, shifting whenever she tried to focus on it. But when she looked directly at it, there was nothing. No figure, no shape, just the faintest outline, like something not entirely there. Suddenly, the air grew colder, impossibly cold. Avery's breath misted in front of her, but the cold didn't make sense. It wasn't a winter chill, it was a deathly cold that seemed to seep into her bones, chilling her from the inside out. Then she heard it, soft, almost indistinguishable at first, but growing clearer with every passing second. A whisper, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all directions. She turned around, heart racing, but there was no one there. Just the dark, endless street stretching out before her. And yet, the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more frantic. She could feel them crawling under her skin, like they were trying to get inside her head. Her vision blurred for a moment, the shadows twisting and warping, as though they had come to life. The trees, the houses, everything began to distort, the world around her folding in on itself. In the blink of an eye, everything went black. Complete darkness. The only thing she could hear was her own heartbeat, pounding in her chest. Then through the blackness, a voice, a whisper that was no longer faint, no longer distant, spoke her name. It was Jack's voice. But it wasn't right. The way he said it, with a twist of malice, it sent a shiver of pure terror down her spine. "Avery, come find me." The voice came from everywhere, from all directions, and Avery couldn't pinpoint its source. She could hear her brother's voice, but it felt wrong. It was twisted, mocking, and distant. And as the whispers turned into full-fledged voices, many voices, something else became clear. Jack wasn't the one calling out to her. Something was watching her. Something was waiting. Avery's stomach turned as the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. The shadows on the street stretched, bending, and reaching out like claws. The whispers grew louder, now calling her name over and over again. But they weren't Jack's voice anymore. They were different. Their tone was mocking, taunting. Then she saw it, the figure again, standing just outside the faintest light, its shadow twisting in ways that defied logic. It was a creature, no longer hidden in the periphery of her vision, but fully formed, shadow-like and distorted, with eyes that burned through the dark like twin embers. It was one of the Shadowborn, and just as quickly it vanished, slipping back into the darkness like it had never been there at all. Avery stood frozen in place, her mind racing to make sense of what she had just witnessed. The creature, the Shadowborn, it was real. But what were they? Where did they come from? Why had they chosen her brother, Jack? And why did the shadows seem to have a mind of their own? The more Avery thought about it, the more the puzzle pieces seemed to fit together. But the picture was too horrifying to fully comprehend. The streets of the town, once so familiar, now felt like a maze of danger. Every corner seemed to hide something lurking just beyond the faint light of the street lamps. The Shadowborn could only be seen in the dimmest light, their movements swift and unnerving, barely perceptible to the naked eye. They thrived in the dark, drawing their power from the shadows themselves. Avery couldn't help but wonder, how long had these creatures been here? Was the town always this way, or had they slowly crept into the lives of the people, unnoticed? The night was growing colder, and as Avery walked, she felt the shadows pressing in around her, pulling at her senses. But it was only when she reached the edge of the town, near the old abandoned church, when she discovered the first real clue. She found an old weather-beaten journal hidden behind a pile of broken bricks near the church's crumbling foundation. Its pages were yellowed and the ink had faded, but Avery could make out a few words in the dim light. The Shadowborn are not of this world. Her heart pounded in her chest as she flipped through the fragile pages. The journal belonged to someone who had once lived in the town, a historian who had made disturbing notes about disappearances that had happened decades ago. He mentioned creatures, shadow-like beings who could manipulate the darkness around them and who had been taking children from the town. The historian had theorized that the Shadowborn had existed for centuries, but no one had believed him until now. But what shocked Avery the most was a diagram sketched hastily in the margins of the journal. The page showed a map of the town, with symbols marked along its borders. Crosses, lines, and symbols Avery didn't recognize. The further she looked, the more unsettling it became. The symbols weren't just random. They were markers, pointing to specific locations in town, the places where children had gone missing. But there was one thing she couldn't understand. One symbol that stood out from the rest, right in the middle of the map, the Shadow Gate. The Shadow Gate. What did it mean? And more importantly, why was it marked in the center of the town? Avery couldn't ignore the sense of dread that settled in her stomach. The deeper she thought about it, the more she realized. There was something ancient at work here. Something powerful that the Shadowborn were connected to. But what was this gate? Was it some kind of portal? A doorway to their realm? Or was it something darker? As Avery's thoughts raced, her flashlight flickered once more. She could feel the cold creeping in around her. But it wasn't just the night air. There was a heaviness, a suffocating presence. The shadows seemed to be moving of their own accord. The Shadowborn weren't just creatures. They were manipulating the very fabric of the darkness itself, using it to trap their prey. And then, just as Avery thought she couldn't take any more, she heard it, a scream. It was her brother, Jack. Avery's blood ran cold as the sound tore through the air, sharp and desperate. It echoed from deep within the shadowed trees, the faintest light barely illuminating the path ahead. Avery didn't hesitate. She ran toward the sound, her breath shallow, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The scream echoed again, this time even more distorted, pleading. But when she reached the spot where the sound had come from, she found nothing. No sign of Jack, no sign of any creature, just a deep, unnerving darkness. It was as if the shadows themselves had swallowed him whole. Avery fell to her knees, her hands trembling as she searched the ground, hoping, praying for a trace, anything to confirm that her brother hadn't disappeared like all the others. But then she saw it, a footprint, a shadow that shouldn't have been there, stretching longer than it should have, and then it moved, right in front of her eyes. Avery turned around to face the source of the movement, and there it was. One of the Shadowborns stood before her, its form barely visible in the half-light, its eyes gleaming with malice, its long, twisting limbs shifting in ways that defied nature. The creature reached out toward her, its hand elongated, with fingers that looked like they could tear through flesh and bone with ease. But as the creature stepped closer, Avery felt something shift. The shadows around her thickened, their very presence choking the life out of her. She had to act fast, but how? The Shadowborn could feel the fear in her, and they thrived on it. The air around her seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. Avery knew that if she didn't act, the Shadowborn would take her too. She had to find the Shadow Gate. She had to rescue Jack before it was too late. The darkness was closing in, and the deeper she went, the more she realized. The Shadowborn weren't just after children. They were after souls, and now they were after hers. What did the Shadow Gate really lead to? Was it possible to escape their realm once you were trapped? And was Avery ready to face what was waiting for her in the depths of darkness? Or was she already too far gone? Avery's heart raced as she stood face to face with the Shadowborn. The creature's dark form seemed to shift with the shadows themselves, its twisted limbs stretching unnaturally, reaching for her. The air was thick with tension, and for the first time, Avery truly understood the danger she was in. This wasn't just some mythical creature. It was real, and it wanted her. But what did it really want? Was it after her, or was it after Jack? Could this be the work of something supernatural? Or was there a darker, more sinister explanation for what had been happening in the town all along? The shadows themselves seemed to whisper secrets, things that were meant to stay hidden. The Shadowborn were part of something much older than Avery could even comprehend, something buried beneath the very ground she stood on. Avery backed away, the creature's presence pressing down on her chest. The air felt thick with its cold, suffocating darkness. With every step, the shadows seemed to close in around her, tighter, until she couldn't tell if she was walking forward or if the world was shrinking around her. Was she already trapped? Was this the point of no return? The scream of Jack echoed once more in her ears, but this time, it wasn't just a cry for help. It was a warning, a call to her. He was somewhere out there, but she couldn't find him. Not yet. But could she? Was she ready to face whatever awaited her in the depths of the Shadowborn's realm? If she ventured further, would she ever make it back? Or would she too become part of their shadowy world forever? As the whispers echoed in her mind, Avery's thoughts began to spin. Her only chance at survival lay in finding the Shadow Gate. But where was it? How could she reach it before the Shadowborn claimed her and Jack? And if she did find it, what would she have to face to escape? Was the gate truly a doorway to their world? Or was it something far worse? What if the Shadowborn weren't the only creatures lurking in the shadows? Could this be the end of Avery and Jack? Would they ever see the light again? Or had they already crossed the threshold into a world from which no one returns? The answers were out there, hidden in the darkness. But Avery could feel it. The Shadowborn weren't just watching, they were waiting for her to make a mistake, to give in to fear. And as Avery's flashlight flickered again, she realized something. The shadows weren't just after her, they were after all of them. The disappearances weren't random, they were part of a much larger plan. What if every child taken, every scream heard, was all leading up to this moment? The Shadowborn weren't just creatures, they were a force of nature, part of something bigger that no one in the town had ever understood. Would Avery make it in time to save Jack? Would she be able to close the door to the Shadowborn's realm, or would she fall victim to their endless hunger? And what was the true nature of the Shadow Gate? Was it really a portal to escape, or was it just another trap waiting for the next soul to wander into its grasp? Could the darkness truly be defeated, or was it destined to claim everything, one shadow at a time? Avery's journey into the shadows revealed more than just the truth behind the Shadowborn. It uncovered the town's darkest secret. These creatures, lurking just beyond the edge of light, weren't random forces of nature. They were part of an ancient, malevolent presence tied to the very fabric of the town itself. Every missing child, every whisper in the dark, had been leading to one inevitable moment: the arrival of the Shadowgate, a portal to a realm where darkness reigns and the lost souls of the past linger, waiting for new victims to join them. But even as Avery ventured deeper into the Shadowborn's world, a part of her began to wonder, could the darkness ever truly be defeated? Or was it destined to claim anyone foolish enough to step too close? The creatures were always watching, always waiting, feeding off fear, their whispers never fully silenced. To this day, no one really knows what happened to Avery or Jack. Were they able to escape the Shadowborn's grasp, or did they become part of the shadows themselves, forever lost in their realm? And what about the Shadowgate? Was it truly a portal of escape, or was it another cruel trap designed to claim any soul brave or foolish enough to seek it? Perhaps some doors are never meant to be opened. What do you think happened to Avery and Jack? Do you believe the Shadowborn are just a myth, or could they be real? Let me know your theories in the comments below. Did Avery make it out? Was there a way to close the gate? Or are the shadows still waiting for their next victim? And don't forget, if you're captivated by stories like this, make sure to subscribe for more chilling tales. There's a new mystery waiting for you every day, and who knows, maybe tomorrow you'll uncover something even darker than this.